Right, hello everybody, welcome. Nice to see such a big turnout for this one. I got some advice from Marsh about the preferred format for running this, and we've had a chat about it, and we've decided to completely ignore Marsh and overrule him. What we're going to do is we're going to kind of keep the whole thing quite tight, because there's a lot of you in here, and we're sure you're going to have some interesting questions. So we'll do a little kind of couple of minutes each, and then we're going to throw it open for questions, and we're just going to kind of treat it as a conversation from there. So, as I say, keeping it very, very tight indeed. We're going to be talking about replication issues like publication bias, etc., in psychology, parapsychology, and science more generally, because we think there are lessons here that go beyond just psychology and parapsychology. Now, I think it's fair to say that probably the biggest problem that parapsychology has had since it began is replication. The problem's always been that different claims are made, and then when people try to replicate them in other experiments, some do, some don't, and it's a big question of, is psi real or isn't it? Now, as a result of that, parapsychologists have actually wrestled with a lot of these problems for a lot longer than have psychologists or other scientists even. I think a lot of the time, skeptics often have an overly negative view of parapsychology. Actually, it's quite often the case that the parapsychologists have thought about these issues before. They're used to it because they get criticized by skeptics like us all the time. And so a lot of these issues have already been considered. So things like, for example, what's called the file draw problem, where the only papers that actually get published are the ones with positive results. But you might have a mass of failed replications stuck away gathering dust in the file drawer. How big a problem is that? There are various other issues that arise. Now, recently what has happened has been that these issues have spilled over into mainstream psychology, and it's been recognized that a lot of the results which are published in top psychology journals may or may not be genuine effects. Now, what really got me very, very interested in this more recently was, if you recall, back in 2011, Darrell Bem, a very well-respected social psychologist at Cornell University, published a very controversial paper in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, a very well-respected mainstream psychology journal, claiming to have found very strong evidence for precognition. And to his credit, he encouraged other people to try to replicate those effects. And three of us, myself, Richard, and Stuart Ritchie up at Edinburgh, decided we would each try and carry out an independent replication and write up the results however it came out. Surprise, surprise, we didn't replicate the results. We sent our paper into the journal that had published the original paper, and the editor didn't even send it out for peer review, simply rejected it on the basis that we don't publish replications. End of story. We tried a couple of other high-impact journals, we got the same treatment. And this became a bit of a story in itself then. So Ben Goldacre, for example, wrote a column about it. The fact is that there is a real bias here. The top journals, A, don't want straight replications, despite supposedly replication being the cornerstone of science, and B, they don't like publishing non-significant results. And so what you read in those journals is not actually representative of research as a whole. This is fed into a wider discussion within psychology, which has highlighted a number of related issues. There is an issue of fraud in all areas of science. It happens. There are some high-profile recent cases within psychology and within other sciences, and 'twas ever thus. Although parapsychology has instances of fraud, I wouldn't say it's any more common in parapsychology than it is in other sciences. So that's one issue. But I think rather more interesting is the grey area of what's called questionable research practices, where people give themselves the benefit of the doubt. In anything but the simplest of experiments, there are lots of decisions to be made about how you collect the data, which data you actually analyze, how you analyze it, do you transform it, do you cut out outliers, do you do this, do you do that? And you're making decisions at the time as you're doing all these things, which are perfectly justifiable it seems to you, but there's a lot of what's called undisclosed flexibility in data analysis, which means that you might often be coming up with a significant result, but it's only because you tried analysing it 8 different ways before you got that significant effect, and then that's what you write up and send off to the journal. And I think when people are doing that, they don't even feel as if they're doing anything that is a particular sin. It's just trying to show the effect that you thought was there in the data anyway. But it exaggerates. It means that you end up with probably reporting some of the effects in these journals are actually probably spurious. Now, this is bad news for psychology, but it's not just bad news for psychology. It's, on the one hand, one of the good things is that psychology at the moment is trying to clean up its act. There are various initiatives underway. There's what's called the Open Science project, where there's an attempt being made to replicate all of the experiments that were reported in 3 top psychology journals throughout the entire year of 2008. And we'll see just how many of them actually do replicate. There are other initiatives as well to try and encourage people to actually be rewarded for carrying out straight replications. Various other things. I won't go into all the details. On the one hand, these questionable research practices have relevance not just for psychology, but for science as a whole. This is not just an issue for psychology. And in many ways, psychologists are trying to kind of lead the way here in cleaning up their act. My view is that a lot of the problems that we're talking about are very relevant for parapsychology. On the basic issue of does psi exist? Do paranormal forces actually exist? There's a constant trickle of positive results published in parapsychology journals, and it's not always for reason you look at it and say, oh, see what they've done wrong. It looks like a well-controlled study. So what's the explanation there? It could well be that these questionable research practices, these other facts I've talked about, are enough to make sure that trickle continues. And maybe there is no real psi there at all. Anyway, I've said enough. That's just to kind of give you the general context. I'm going to hand over to Richard, and then we'll hear from Chris, who is a psychologist and a parapsychologist.
Thank you, Chris. So just to go over some of that, again, in terms of the sort of history of parapsychology, what you have is a series of essentially what have been labelled false dawns, in that if you go back to, say, Rye in the 30s with the card guessing, people seem to be doing a little bit better than chance on guessing the identity of hidden cards. When the parapsychologists tried to replicate that, and some skeptics did as well, the replications kind of tailed off, the effect declined, the so-called decline effect. And so then you have the next period with things like dream telepathy or dream precognition, where people dream at night apparently about future events. Again, it doesn't replicate. The same sort of thing with remote viewing, the same sort of thing with what's called the Ganzfeld, people in sensory deprivation trying to get an external target. And so the question is, what is going on there? And there are really sort of a couple of arguments. One is that psychic abilities are genuine. And for some reason, they simply don't replicate over time. There's been various theories about that. The other is that initially the experiments which do show a psi effect are due to some sort of methodological problem or the file drawer effect or whatever, and when you tighten those things up, those effects go away. And most skeptics would fall into that latter camp. And that process of here's the effect, but what about file draw, what about multiple analysis, what about all these problems, that's been going on between the proponents and the skeptics within parapsychology for about 100 years. And as Chris said, very recently, last 10 years or so, those arguments have started to come into psychology, into mainstream science. Exactly the same arguments are going on for 100 years in parapsychology. And so now we're starting to look at some other psychological findings and go, well, hold on a second. The evidence for those is about as good as the evidence for some psi, and maybe these things are not quite as robust as we thought. And then very recently it's moved into medicine, mainstream science. You probably heard about the All Trials Registry idea, Ben's idea, and Sense About Science, where we're saying to the pharmaceutical industry, hold on a second, you're saying this drug works, but you're not reporting all of your trials. When you do that, suddenly the drug isn't as effective as you think. So what's happened is a series of arguments from parapsychology have come over to psychology, to mainstream science. And for me, the interesting issue, and I've written a couple of papers on this, is how we go forward. How do we decide which effects are genuine, which ones aren't? And I think we can learn a lot from the history of parapsychology in terms of that movement forward.
Good to meet. I think it's certainly true that psychology is experiencing a crisis at the moment. People are very concerned about these questionable research practices, but I think it's rather a success story rather than something to wring our hands about, because I think what we're really doing is acknowledging concerns that actually apply all the way through the history of science as we understand it. Some of major figures in history now have engaged in questionable research practices. Newton's data, for example, it was reported to a degree of accuracy that wasn't possible in his day as part of his spat with Leibniz. Gregor Mendel's data are too perfect, according to R.A. Fisher. Robert Millikan's data, when he was looking at the properties of the electron, he's got a batch of laboratory books, and he was very selective. He's got little notes that incriminate himself as to which data he was going to report and which data he wasn't going to report. He only reported about a third of the data. Ironically, if he'd presented all the data, he would have still presented the same case. He would have made a more persuasive case. So we have this sense that some questionable practices have been around since the beginning of science as we now understand it. And that, as Chris said, many people don't think that many of these things are problematic. And I think that's what's really changed. I think in many ways, parapsychology has been in the vanguard because it's been subject to much more criticism from outside. People have had to be much more careful in terms of the methodological decisions they've made. And people have queried those because they have a sense that people are reporting phenomena which, a priori, are impossible. And so parapsychology, for example, has had a long-standing policy of reporting non-significant results in its main journals, something which is extremely difficult to do in other areas of the social science. Parapsychology was in the vanguard in having registries where people described methodologies for future studies. They registered those with journals prior to conducting the studies so that there's no scope to deviate from those elements. I think there are also problems with selective approaches in terms of how you analyse data, which bits you present. And again, some of that's really quite innocent. What you want to do is tell a coherent story, one that gives us the best insight into the phenomenon you're investigating. So it's not duplicitous necessarily. But now with the advent of meta-analysis, we tend to instead revert to a standard outcome measure that we apply across all a variety of studies. And when that's been used in parapsychology, it's tended to be ultra-conservative. And using that measure, we still find that people are doing rather better than they should be doing. People have had concerns that parapsychology effects are really just on the margin, kind of p less than 0.05. Very little is going on, and it might be very easily attributable to some of these little slips, these methodological errors. In fact, when you look at these meta-analyses, the typical effect sizes in parapsychology are absolutely comparable to those in other areas of social science. An enormous meta-analysis of social psychology databases, for example, shows that the average effect size is 0.21. Some of the data that I've been involved in has a weighted average effect size of 0.22. Parapsychology databases for some of the main paradigms range from about 0.15 to about 0.3. So there are kind of absolutely the kinds of effect sizes we would expect in the social sciences, given the very complex systems that we're looking at, with the loads of variables that we're not effectively controlling in our experiments. We need to track that back through, though. I think one of the issues we want to make is that psychologists are the ones wringing their hands because in many ways they're best placed to investigate these phenomena by, for example, surveying other researchers about their practices and what they consider to be legitimate and illegitimate. But there is a sneaking suspicion that all of these concerns apply to other areas of science as well. In particular, if we're looking at things like fraud, where people are fabricating data or misrepresenting data sets, it is much more common in the biomedical sciences than it is in these other areas. Maybe in part because there's a vast array of literature, many more studies being conducted in those areas, but also because the rewards are much greater in those areas. A classic book looking at fraud and error, written in 1983 by Broad and Wade, called Betrayers of the Truth, describes that there are 4 key properties or characteristics that you would want if you were going to be fraudulent as a scientist. First of all, you want the likelihood of your being detected to be low. Secondly, you want to have your findings be generally acceptable to fit in with the kind of mainstream so that people don't look too closely in the first place. And also that if you are caught, that you'll be dealt with very discreetly, maybe kind of shoved out the side door. And those are the kind of properties that we find in areas like the biomedicine, genetics work. We really don't find that in much of psychology, and certainly not in parapsychology.
Okay, well, we hope we've given you some food for thought there. So we will now actually throw it open for questions.
Hello. I'd like to know, how are you defining parapsychology? while you are.
Okay, that's a very good question.
Is it the study of paranormality within science, or it's the parapsychology that we associate with defending paranormality?
I think that, again, there is no kind of one universally accepted definition. I think most people, and I'll obviously defer to Chris on this one, would go along with some kind of definition along the lines of investigation of supposed or actual phenomena which cannot be explained in terms of our current scientific understanding. Would you go with that?
Broadly, I think there's very little difference in practice between anomalistic psychology and parapsychology. I think ultimately what we're trying to do is understand people's experience and explain those things. That though, and normally what we're interested in are situations where people's attributions to those experiences are paranormal. They think this isn't something that can be explained in mundane or normal terms. There must be something else going on, maybe some kind of dualistic explanation. But within parapsychology, absolutely, that includes conventional explanations. So if it turns out that your experience is a case of sleep paralysis, for example, or misattribution, I would still class that as parapsychology. Maybe one distinction, though, is that as well as understanding how people might be mistaken in a spontaneous experience, we try and bring some of those claims into the laboratory, where we can better control the conditions, we can rule out some of those normal explanations, and see if any of those effects still survive.
I think it's
I'm sorry to one, because every time we hear people... just a follow-up, usually, at least in the media, whenever you hear people talking about parapsychology, they are defending spirituality, past lives, all that sort of precognition, all that sort of abilities that, as far as I know, are not proven.
And very often those are people I've never heard of or seen before. The problem is that parapsychologist and parapsychology are not protected terms. The term psychologist is not protected either, but you can at least be chartered with the British Psychological Society, and that gives some sense of authenticity. So I think in many of those situations, if people are seeing angels, for example, or they're reporting on past lives through hypnosis, they're probably not members of the Parapsychological Association, for example.
So there are distinctions here. So I think most people would associate parapsychology, or most academics, with the psi hypothesis, which is the notion that we have some kind of psychic ability, such as ESP or precognition, or maybe psychokinesis, the ability to change the world with your mind. And there's been quite a lot of lab research done into that, and that forms the basis for academic parapsychology. You then have the survival hypothesis, which not many academics will look at, which is the whole, do we survive bodily death? And that really isn't as popular. And then outside of that, outside of academia, that you have all the strange weirdness, and they will often use the word parapsychology, as you say, in many, many weird ways. But in terms of, if you go to a Parapsychological Association convention, which is probably the fairest way of assessing it, you would mainly hear papers about the psi hypothesis, and as Chris says, sometimes about other normal explanations for these experiences. But I think for the most part, we're looking at the psi hypothesis, the fact we have psychic abilities or don't. Yeah.
I think the bottom line would be that parapsychologists would presume that any phenomenon is lawful and explicable. So we're not interested in anomalies for their own sake, that there's some mystery in the world. It absolutely should be amenable to scientific test. It should be replicable under certain conditions, and it should adhere to certain kinds of laws.
Okay, next question. There was a lady here? Oh, sorry, okay. Yeah, can we do this lady next after that one, because she did have a hand up early on.
I've got two questions, both of them very short. So I recently had to write an essay about whether or not parapsychology is a pseudoscience. And as part of that, I came across a video of Chris, I think, defining anomalistic psychology, or sort of differentiating between anomalistic psychologists and parapsychologists, mainly by anomalistic psychologists take the view that there is no such thing as psi, and parapsychologists take the opposite view. And so firstly, are there any functional differences between how you study that? And is that not a bit of a strange way to come about it from a scientific perspective? And the second question, I suppose, would be, if you're defining psi negatively, as in what we don't yet have an explanation for, does psi not necessarily exist in every sort of branch of science of any sort?
Yeah, good point. I think, it kind of relates back to the first question, that I think to a large extent, I call myself an anomalistic psychologist, if you like, to flag up the fact that for most of what I do, my working hypothesis is let's assume psi doesn't exist. Can we explain the weird experiences that people have in terms of normal psychological principles? And although, there is a strand of our work where we directly test paranormal claims as well, in which case we're doing parapsychology. And I think very often, as Chris says, a lot of what he does, there may be a difference in emphasis. Chris will do relatively more studies which are directly testing the psi hypothesis, and maybe relatively fewer that are looking at the psychological aspects of belief. But we both do both, but I think that maybe one reason for calling myself an anomalistic psychologist, and if ever I'm introduced, say, on a TV program as being a parapsychologist, I always say, no, I'm a psychologist with an interest in paranormal experiences, ostensibly paranormal experiences. So it's really a way of trying to flag up those differences in emphasis, I think, as much as anything else. On the issue of the negative definition of the paranormal and therefore parapsychology, it is an issue. The people have argued that parapsychology, if it were to be successful, it would define itself out of existence. At one point, when they didn't understand how bats navigated, for example, some people seriously put forward the hypothesis that it might be some form of psychic ability, until they figured out it was essentially sonar, and then it obviously just comes back into the realm of ordinary conventional science. So, in a sense, that's not really a problem for me. I don't know what thoughts Chris has on it.
No, very similar, really. I think if you're testing a particular claim, you don't have to believe that claim. I think very often it's important to be disinterested in it in some way in order to design an effective test. So there's no necessity for people to believe in psychic phenomena in order to conduct this kind of research. I think that's important. In terms of the negative definition, I think it is problematic. It represents the kind of early status of this discipline, that we have limited understanding of the nature of these phenomena. But it's... That is often stated, that the paranormal research has been conducted for 100 years. The Society for Psychical Research was established in 1882. I was at a conference last week, and there were 6 presentations from neuroscience labs. There were more people working in those 6 labs in the whole world on parapsychology. In terms of the person hours that have been invested in those 100 years of research, it amounts to about 4 months of North American social psychology. So the fact that we haven't made massive strides isn't a reflection of 100 years of deep concerted effort to explore these phenomena. I think there are patterns in the data, which is why I'm interested in pursuing that kind of research. They're not simply anomalies. If they were simply statistical blips, then they would be relatively uninteresting. As I mentioned before, we expect these to be lawful, for them to be explicable. And so we're encouraged by the fact that certain people tend to perform better than other people reasonably consistently, again, with the caveats that I mentioned before, that they tend to perform better under certain conditions than other conditions, that some of the data, some of the outcomes map onto reasonably well particular theoretical accounts for what's going on. So in those ways, I think we can be encouraged to think this isn't just a negatively defined phenomenon. Something weird happens in the kind of Gary Larson kind of cartoon. It's a little bit more complex than that.
Yeah, that's right. So I've worked in the field for about a decade, probably a bit longer than that actually, and published quite a lot there. And in the end, I left the field. I don't work in parapsychology anymore. And I think the reason for that was that I thought most parapsychologists weren't willing to conclude in favour of the null hypothesis, in the sense that if they got a negative result, you rarely saw in a paper, oh, this may be because psi doesn't exist. What you saw was sort of, oh, maybe we didn't quite trap it in the right way. And so I ended up writing my final paper, actually, was a paper which I now give to anyone who approaches me if they're a potential PhD student, who says, I want to work in parapsychology. I go, that's absolutely fine, but read this. And the paper's called Heads I Win, Tails You Lose, which is about the fact that the way in which parapsychologists, and it has to be said, other scientists as well, hold on to their cherished hypothesis in the face of negative evidence for it. And so my feeling is, in terms of if there is a problem with the field, it is that it doesn't conclude, it's set up not to conclude for the null hypothesis, to always kind of leave the door open and to keep on going, as you say, for 100 years. But that's slightly different to the topic that we're talking about, which is about replication and how you try and reach closure. Which is my main thing in that paper, which is how do we close this debate? It's been going for 100. Let's imagine we only have another 10 years left. How do we close down this debate and try and make some decision one way or the other?
Just following from that, we have this Popperian notion of hypothesis and refutation, which is a lovely idea, but the fact is that most science doesn't work that way. Sociology of science has, over the last 25, 30 years, from Kuhn onwards really, has demonstrated that it's very difficult for people to be negotiated out of perspectives that they haven't really been negotiated into. And it's not just peculiar to this. Whichever area people are working in, so if you're working in, I don't know, social priming or something, and you're invested in a particular hypothesis, a particular theory, it's incredibly difficult to winkle people out from that position to accept that maybe the data don't support it.
I mean, at the end of the day, all of these kinds of problems arise, well, due to cognitive biases that we all suffer from. And the single most pervasive cognitive bias that affects us all, believers, skeptics, everyone, is confirmation bias. And again, just to emphasize, this is not just about parapsychology and psychology. You can look back at the history of science, and very often you'll see that the people who work in the natural sciences probably have even less of an appreciation of these kinds of issues. And Rupert Sheldrake, to hate to use that name, folks, no, he's a good mate of mine actually, and he has actually shown that the use of double-blind procedures hardly ever happens in the natural sciences. It happens a lot in parapsychology, it happens a bit in psychology, but in the natural sciences, it doesn't happen very much at all. And so then that's why you'll get episodes like the Benveniste case, data being presented for homeopathy, because they just didn't really see the possible role of subjective bias. But it is there, it's always going to be there, and it can lead to claims for effects that just aren't real. So, this lady here, yeah.
Hi, so I'm working in biology, and we're having these big discussions about whether just publishing all data open access is a solution to this problem of scientific mispractice. Do you think this is feasible and a possible solution in psychology and parapsychology?
I mean, I think there's a very strong move at the moment, very strong push for not only kind of open access in terms of publishing in open access journals, but also open data. So the whole data sets would be published. And I think that is definitely the way to go. I think it might actually be problematic in practice. Because, I mean, for example, just to say, you know, as a psychologist working at Goldsmiths in a psychology department, does that mean I would have to kind of pre-register every single student project that I supervise? Because sometimes if you get interesting results from a student project, you might actually write it up for publication. But it would massively increase the workload on all researchers. Now, I think if we're dealing with, for example, if we're dealing with funded research that's actually, you know, a big project where you want people to take the results seriously, then pre-registration and open access for all the data is definitely the way forward. And I mean, again, parapsychology has to some extent led the way in terms of pre-registration and issues like that. I'm sure Richard's got things to add to that, yeah?
I do, because I have a hatred of student projects. I just do not think they should ever reach publication stage. No, I'm serious. So for years I've argued that in psychology, I don't know about other disciplines, psychology, obviously you run participants in an experiment, and you might run 50 or 100 to get a reasonable sample size. I've argued for years that students should only run 5, and then just make up the rest of their data. And then, because we're not judging them on their ability to get people into a cubicle and look at a computer screen, you know, this is not, you know, an act of persuasion that we're trying to sort of judge them on their persuasive skills. So what do I care that they can get 100 people in? I care they can get 5 in, and then I can care that they can analyse their data and write it up. That's what I care about. That's where our emphasis should be. We should not publish student projects. You know, the data is enormously unreliable. I do not know any student that actually runs the stuff. They all make it up. We know they do that. Let us not pretend. So I think they should be published. The other thing, very briefly, is that Ben actually had an interesting idea. I think it's Ben, I'm not certain, it may be other, but Ben told me about it, which was that, again, in psychology, every study you do has to go through an ethics committee. And so the weird thing is, we've got a record of every study there. Now, what we don't know, and we know most of those have been conducted, but how many of them have been published? So actually, you do have a record in psychology of every study that the investigators intended to do. And his idea was you go to every ethics committee and say, give us your list of studies, and now let's see how many of those got published. And that is a kind of way of doing an all trials thing with psychology.
I'm a bit worried for Hertfordshire students. I don't think I'll be employing any as PhD students anytime soon.
Well, no, but it's not just, there's something about Hertfordshire students at all. The fact is that why should we judge students on their ability to get 100 people into a room? And we know that, students make stuff up. This is about their ability to analyse data, to write up reports and think about it critically. The data itself, I care not.
Right. Well, that's how Diederik Stapel started and decided he didn't need to bother with participants and so just made up the data.
Well, no. Obviously, I wouldn't say this is a career progression. You would say this is a thing we're doing in this instance because you're being judged on the ability to think critically. When it comes to a proper experiment, right, there are safeguards in place to stop that.
I've published 3 or 4 of my student projects. I'm quite comfortable with it. I think it's an important learning phase for the students as well, because engaging with real participants and understanding how important those interactions are for any psychological study are a key part of their progression. Those students are typically going on to do masters or PhDs, so I think it's really important for that kind of insight. I think there is a problem as part of that file drawer that you cherry pick only the ones that seem to show the nice pattern and maybe don't report the others, and that's true for the anomalistic as well as the parapsychology. What do we do when it's endemic? That's occurring in all psychology departments across the country, and it's not easy to differentiate, particularly when you've got a major figure who's lead author on the paper, and then there might be 4 or 5 names afterwards. How can we quality assure that?
You mean...
That it's going on, it's rife, it's endemic, so it's happening. How can you differentiate which of those published papers are sound and which may be due to data that are perhaps more dubious because they come from undergraduates?
Oh, I see. So well, my answer is if it's an undergraduate project, don't publish it. Full stop.
Yep, but if they are doing it, what can we do about it?
Well, my argument is don't do it.
Okay.
So
okay, so that's all we need to, okay.
In a sense, I avoid the issue on it. But you're right. I mean, if it is being published, then this is why replication is so important. And so the idea is that one group published something, and maybe their data's a bit screwy, but if several people can replicate it, well, that's fine. But then you get into issues, well, was it replicated? Is it a conceptual replication or an actual replication? Well, their subjects, just by definition, will be different to the subjects over here. So is that the reason you got it all gets very messy very quickly?
Okay, next question.
I have a question here.
Okay. Yep.
I'd just like to give some basis from what happens in industry. Something that I was involved in as an algorithm engineer is we had a source of data and we had to reduce noise to increase detection rates. And the approach that we used was the algorithm team would take data, analyse the data, and we're free to take out outliers and things, and then we'd come up with a model and implement the model, but then it was handed over to a completely separate test team who would then run through large amounts of data and then say yes or no whether it actually worked or not. And I think that's the independent between the people coming up with the model and the people testing the model, whether the professors could come up with the models and then they'd be left to the graduate students to actually test the models, and there'd be sort of a Chinese war between them.
Well, it's an interesting idea. I mean, I think that's related to the kind of notion of the distinction between kind of planned data analysis and post hoc data analysis, and this is another kind of general theme that runs across everything that we're talking about here. That one of the kind of worries is that what often happens is you run the experiment, you collect the data, you do the analysis that you plan to do, and you don't get the result that you wanted. And so then you think, well, actually, maybe that data needs transforming, or maybe I should take out these outliers, or maybe I should do this test rather than that test. And of course, if you then get a result that does seem to support what you want, that's what you write it up. But the people reading the report won't know that you tried all these other ways of analysing it to have several bites of the cherry. Now, there's nothing wrong with that kind of post hoc analysis if it is clear that it is post hoc analysis. And then you do a follow-up study where you test that particular hypothesis directly, which is pretty much what you're saying. And yes, if people did that, that would be absolutely fantastic. I mean, again, to give an example from parapsychology, the European Journal of Parapsychology used to have, they tried it, it didn't work for whatever reason, I don't know, but it was a brilliant idea. Their idea was that you submitted a paper to them before you had even run the experiment. And essentially you wrote the introduction, the design section, you said how you were going to analyse the data, and on that basis they would either accept or reject it, and then you ran the study and wrote it up with the analysis as outlined. And that was a brilliant idea, but for whatever reason, as I say, it never actually caught on. But it's a similar sort of idea to pre-registration, basically.
It is. The other thing you can do, which actually doesn't happen very much now, but it was a good idea, was the split half data. So you randomly allocate your data to two separate pools. You look for effects here, and then you see whether they are also in this half, gives you a little bit more confidence. But there is a difference, I think, with engineering, because here we're talking about statistical stuff. So we want to know whether the drug works or not. We never know for certain. It's always going to be a statistical question. Where if you're building a bridge, and you know pretty quickly whether that bridge works or the whole thing collapses. So in a sense, it's not like, oh, look, the bridge works 80% of the time. That's good enough for me. Sometimes I think the models can be slightly different.
The design you suggest is actually more common in areas like cognitive psychology, where very typically they'll report a suite of experiments. There'll be an exploratory study, and then there'll be a number of confirmations and extensions. That sometimes is a little bit easier. Cognitive psychology experiments can be a bit quicker and more dirty. A colleague I used to know for her PhD, she had 10 experiments for a PhD, which is quite a lot by PhD standards. But of those, only 2 actually confirmed the theory that she was working with. You can guess which 2 were published and which 8 weren't.
We've got a question just over on this side first.
Yeah.
I'm just curious as to, amongst people who advocate that psi abilities are real, do they have they put forward any kind of hypothesis or theory as to why they would express themselves in such a sort of feeble way? And if somebody does have an ability to predict the turn of a card and so on and so forth, why doesn't it express itself in a really robust way? Has anybody come up with any kind of model as to why that might be the case? Because it seems like these tiny statistical variations are all we're looking at.
Yeah. Lots of the abilities that we have are actually quite feeble. We don't have the vision of an eagle, we don't have the sense of smell of a dog, even though both of those are biologically possible. So clearly there are limiting principles at work. It's very difficult to know what they are, but presumably they're evolutionarily driven. I couldn't possibly speak to what they are. A working hypothesis that we're interested in at Northampton is the idea that psi is essentially an unconscious process that directs behaviour. And so the times when we have people who have a vivid psychic experience are actually aberrations or anomalies rather than like seeing visual illusions. And so they're not very typical of the normal process. So there's a lot of interest just now in having people work in situations where at the time they don't realise that they're performing a psi task and that their performance then determines a contingent outcome. They either get a reward or a punishment later on. Those are quite interesting. The effect sizes are not enormous, but we ran a series of 8 experiments at Greenwich and at Northampton. The cumulative effect size is something like 0.22 on those. P-value is 4 zeros, 5 zeros and a 9, something like that. So there's a subtle but highly significant effect in some of those psi unconscious studies.
And there's also theories which are sort of trickster-based or psi as intentional elements. So it's the notion that psi itself somehow knows you're trying to trap it. And if the conditions are such that your experiment would be perfect, which would prove psi, it won't turn up. So there's those sorts of hypotheses, but that makes it almost unfalsifiable as a hypothesis. So it's a strange field, but a colourful one, an interesting one.
There's also a really nice paper that's compared performance in laboratory conditions with field phenomena in a range of other psychological areas, nothing to do with parapsychology. And the relationship between those two, the reliability from one context to the other, is incredibly low, except in specialised areas such as occupational psychology, so business and management. In most areas, it seems like many of the phenomena that occur in the laboratory simply don't translate into those real-world situations.
Okay, next question.
We've got one just here at the back. And then.
Thanks. Chris, you mentioned that sort of the awareness for methodological scrutiny started off in parapsychology, moved on to psychology, and then reached medicine. But in some areas, medicine is ahead. It's absolutely the norm to do double-blind tests, so to not have the research being involved in the data collection. It's more and more the norm that the statistical analysis is being someone who's also not aware of what's being tested. Why is that not yet really the norm in psychology?
It's a good question. I mean, again, it's partly just discipline-specific traditions in terms of the ways of doing things. I mean, and things do change, things do move on. So at the moment, again, another big debate in psychology is whether the way that we were all taught, using kind of inferential statistics and p-values and so on, whether that is actually not the right way to do it, because sometimes you can get statistically significant effects that are just below the 0.05 level, therefore you'll write it up and send it off for publication, but actually are kind of meaningless beyond that, don't have any real significance in the real world sense. And so I think a lot of that is just down to those kinds of traditional differences between disciplines. And although, again, you know, medicine is a very good example of where we all think of double-blind procedures or even triple-blind procedures being applied. Again, it's not applied in all areas, as you will know, and obviously what the All Trials Registered campaign is all about is making sure that if you do the study and you find a particular result, but you don't tell anybody about it because it's not what the pharmaceutical company wanted you to find, then again, it's a different form of bias. So there's a lot of different issues all kind of tied up together, and really it's a matter of trying to kind of clean up not just psychology's act, but across science as a whole, trying to kind of take hold and deal with these issues. It's very easy for me to say this because obviously I'll kind of be retiring within the foreseeable future, and so I can make life difficult for all the young scientists who are on the way up. They've got to do it right. They've not got to get away with doing it the way I did it.
We've got a question down here at the front. We've got a few 10 minutes left as well.
10 minutes left? Yeah.
Quite quickly.
Sure.
We want to get through a lot more questions.
Okay, so one of the things I want to ask you about is the link between medical science, physical science, and psychology, and Wakefield. The medical profession took hold of Wakefield eventually, and were very instrumental in outing him and you know, rubbishing his findings. You take Burt in psychology, and the psychological profession never really did get to grips with Burt, never did publicly come out and replicate him or sort of deny him. So my education was built on Burt's premises about the 11+. And what I see now, I'm just going to ask you to comment here, is the BPS research bulletin that I get in my email box. Well over 50% of the research they report, the subject group is students. The subject pool is students. There's poor results, poor outcome, but they make bold statements. And when you go back to Burt, the government took those bold statements and created education policy for all of us based on the back of that. So, you know, what do you think about that and the significance of that?
Well, again, I mean, Sir Cyril Burt would probably be the most famous case of, some would say alleged fraud, because there are still people who defend him, as you know, and I just don't know the details, not even the details to know whether or not. He was certainly a lot sloppier if he wasn't actually a fraud than he gave the impression of being, and yes, his results had a huge impact on education policy. I think basically most psychologists would be aware of the fact that Burt's results should be treated with a very, very high degree of caution. And the fact is that these allegations were only made after he had died anyway, so there was no way of, you know, kind of taking any action against him other than to try and investigate further. No, absolutely, yeah.
At the beginning of, I think it's Woody Allen's Love and Death, Woody Allen plays his character. He says, I've worked out that God doesn't exist. And the female lead opposite him says, my God, if God doesn't exist, there's no meaning to life, we might as well kill ourselves. And Woody Allen says, well, there's no need to be hasty. And that's how I feel about a lot of psychological research. I think a lot of psychologists know their stuff is a bit dodgy, And the last thing they want is any practical implication of it. So if you say to them, you have shown, oh my goodness, amazing experiments, this suggests we should change the way in which we educate children. They go, well, there's no need to be hasty. So I think it's the same thing. Actually, there is a reluctance. It's for the same reason why a lot of psychologists are quite reluctant to talk to the media about their work, because it's that same thing. I think there's a lot of dodginess, not only in psychology, but in science, actually. And that is, so it's all a bit games playing-y. And that's why, and being responsible people, they then go, well, I don't want that out in the real world with real world implications of it. There's a kind of stepping back at that point, which I think is very curious.
I think also the academic environment encourages people to make more definitive statements. So if you want the next research grant, if you want that paper to be published in this journal with a high impact factor rather than that journal, then it's not very useful to have lots of little caveats and clauses in there. So it encourages people to be bolder and to make greater claims than they can deliver. I think what we need to do, and in a way what I think we're arguing for as well, is this idea that the infrastructure needs to take a step back and think about the ways, that, for example, that we encourage immediacy. So what we want are really quick studies that you can complete in 2 or 3 years. We don't want very expensive, highly integrated studies that might really tackle an important issue but might take 15 years to deliver. We want something we can do 2 or 3 years so you can tell us what the outcomes are, so we can give you the next tranche of money. And I think all that's wrong.
Another question? Yep.
Hello. Got a question, maybe Professor Wiseman, following along really what you said about not publishing undergraduate results. Often, if undergraduates write papers or project reports, you go through, there can be lots and lots of mistakes which need to be corrected, but they've often acquired big mass of data. They could have written loads of computer code and passed it through all kinds of statistical packages to get the results they've got. And you don't really necessarily check that with any of the rigour. You check the written report, and in the written report you find loads of errors. And we all know there are 3 types of people in this world: those that can count and those that can't. So I'm just wondering how much of the results that are published, even in good papers, are flawed because people haven't done their sums right. Is there any data on that?
I don't know about data on that. I mean, that again is another reason why I think that one should be a bit sceptical about student projects. There is actually, just off the back of that though, so hopefully because it goes through peer review, people do check the results and so on, but actually going back to the raw data, probably that doesn't happen, but if it's published in open access, is the argument now that other people would go back to the raw data. There's a really interesting quick point though, that when you submit a paper, if you've done the analyses blind, which you should have done, you decided in advance which analyses to do with it before you've seen the data, that's fine. A referee sees it, and they often say you can only publish this if you do these analyses. And they are making that decision non-blind. And so what's really interesting, you don't know when you look at a paper whether those were the original analyses or they've been suggested by referees. And so I've always argued that you should say these were my original analyses, and then I was asked to change it in these ways. It's another form of methodological error that actually it simply isn't present at the minute in the present system. We don't know the degree to which the analyses you're seeing were not the ones that were intended.
Got a question right over here.
Hi, I wanted to ask a bit about the study replication. You brought up at the beginning that this is a problem, that studies in general aren't replicated, and you're trying to create some incentives to change that. And that's great. But it strikes me that certain studies absolutely are replicated. And so there's obviously something, there are existing incentives that do work, because we see them. When cold fusion came out, that was replicated instantly. When the IPCC study that came out of ClimateGate, I think that's been replicated 8 times now, because people had a vested interest in vetting that data or defending that data, et cetera. So is it really the journal's fault that they don't want to publish more replications? Or is there a systemic failure somewhere that people don't want to see them published at all?
I think, well, a few points there. I mean, one thing to emphasize is that although there are replication problems certainly in psychology, definitely in parapsychology and arguably in other sciences as well, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of robust, replicable psychological effects. So it's not to say that you can't trust anything you ever read in a psychology textbook or paper, yet most of it is probably true. The problem is that there will be some bits, some effects which aren't, and you can't tell just from reading the paper. There's no doubt at all that, replication... Some of the... I've forgotten what the question was, I'm sorry, can you repeat it? I was waffling there.
Sorry, I'm saying, my question is, who's really at fault that we don't see more replication?
Yeah, thank you. The thing is that in the old days, perhaps, with traditional scientific journals, you could maybe justify not publishing replications because it was expensive to produce those journals. They wanted to give the latest cutting-edge findings, etc., etc. I think there's kind of a less of a case for that in the internet age. For example, even traditional journals could have sections where they just publish the abstract of replications, whether they're positive findings or negative findings, and then the full details could be available online through a link. So that kind of argument falls away. And there's an interesting contrast, I think, between the traditional journals, the ones that have come in for quite a lot of criticism, and the open access journals. Open access journals, like parapsychology journals, tend to be much more likely to have a policy that they'll say, we will publish negative findings, we will publish straight replications. And I think that's a very healthy thing.
I was going to add that I think there is a systemic failure, which is that it's very difficult to get research funding for simple, straight replications. It has to be a replication with extension because there's no new knowledge if you simply confirm somebody else's finding. Even though it makes that initial finding more robust, the power is greater, it doesn't really go beyond that. And I think in a similar way, editors, I think, are loath to publish straight replications that fail because it's very little to know what to make of them. There's a multitude of reasons why a replication attempt may be unsuccessful that actually don't undermine the original claim. And it's very difficult to know which of those might apply in this particular case.
Sorry, one more thing. Isn't that in itself the absolute most important factor of replication? Sorry, that's exactly why you do replication.
Yep.
If it doesn't match, then that poses a new question that
I agree completely.
Is extremely important.
Yes. And we need an array of those replications. Yeah.
It's very hard in psychology because you can't get that same group of people in the same frame of mind and so on, so you've always got that problem. There was a recent study where they tried to replicate about, I think it was 200 experiments in psychology, and 80% of them did replicate. So when you read an experiment, there is an 8 out of 10 chance that it is correct.
Okay.
That's the good news.
So I think on that bombshell, we'll draw things to a close. Thank you very much for coming along today. Thank you.